I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey. I mean, it's a really interesting title. So what do you think? Is AI as bigger or not as big as the hype?
I get a call from my 70-year-old mother at 5 a.m. in the morning. And whenever you get a call, you always think, man, it's for the worst. She calls up and, after a 5-second silence, she says, are you working on AI? So I told, man, it took me 25 years, to...
Finally, I'm in.
Generative AI has actually made AI relevant. It really connects the people of all age groups, right? You're able to get use cases which are meaningful to the audience.
ChatGPT is my new best friend and research analyst, right?
As a product manager, you really have the foundation to understand what do you do outside the box. What does an experience really mean? Can I decipher that experience into what needs to happen on the hardware side, what needs to happen on the software side, combining them together? I think as a product manager, you get the entire pipe exposed.
Hello, I'm Jocelyn Houle, and welcome to the BetterTech podcast. We're super excited today to talk about generative AI and its applications. We're even more excited to welcome our guest, Vinesh Sukumar, who is the Senior Director of AI and ML Product Management at Qualcomm. Welcome.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Really a pleasure joining your show.
It's amazing to have you on here. And this is, of course, the hottest topic. You can't have any discussion in technology without addressing AI. And it's a topic of interest to everyone, but also to me. But before we get into it, I thought maybe, for our audience, Qualcomm is a massive company. And when I saw the notes for this, I was like, I definitely know what they do. But maybe I don't. Can you kind of frame it up for me about the size of the company and what the focus on innovation really is at Qualcomm?
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. I've been in Qualcomm for give or take about 4 years. It's been a fantastic organization. For the general audience, Qualcomm as a company historically, which was very much focused on on communications, but now as an organization, Qualcomm is transforming itself to really enable a world where everyone, everything can be intelligently connected. And at the same time, we're trying to really focus on efficiently scaling the technology. Then this could be AI, could be camera, and many other technologies that kind of set the anchor point for mobile, and using that as a central piece of innovation, we scale to adjacent business units like automotive, like IoT, AR, VR, and plenty of form factors.
Interesting. I'm just going to take a couple of notes there because I want to come back to ask you about some of those things.
Sure.
But I think the other thing is I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey. I mean, it's a really interesting title, and I think people would be really interested to know kind of how you made your way into AI and ML product management. And I actually left something off your introduction. You're also a PhD. So how'd you get started? Was that your dream as a little young man? Were you like, this is what I'm doing?
No. I think it's a great question. In my childhood, I used to spend a lot of time at my grandparents' place, and I used to be quite good. It's not say good, but I was like a curious George. Try to rip apart a lot of old stuff in the garage. Times, set fire, see exactly what happens. And my grandparents obviously were not happy. They wanted to be more push me out of the house so that then the house was at least safe because that's the only property they had. But during my fun times, my late grandparents, really put a lot more emphasis on electronics, understood how things are, and that's how it kind of started up. I think with time, as I started to go into college, a lot more emphasis on digital electronics. I'm talking about 20, 25 years ago. And as I started to graduate out of college, with my master's degree at that point of time, was mostly into digital, trying to really understand how zeros and ones work. So at least I would say my initial introduction into data. Not only sure exactly what it meant, but I knew that it can create a lot of graphs, and you can predict a lot of patterns using graphs, those kind of things. Now, with time, for good or bad reason, we had initial concepts of artificial intelligence in those days called computer vision, which was kind of set up. So I started putting a lot more focus on vision pattern recognition, and that's how I kind of started to get my advanced degree. And my very first job was at Jet Propulsion Labs, and one of my initial anchor points was to a lot of these big charts was provided to me, and I was asked to classify them. Now, those days, classifying these charts, and these charts were kind of taken up from huge spacecrafts. So, and there was like giant printers which took about 30 minutes to print. The dot matrix printers, if you guys are very familiar with that. Mm-hmm. And then once you get these giant sheets, at the end of the day, you take magnifying glasses, drop boxes, That's how the region of interest started. And say this region of interest is A building A, this region of interest is B, this B region of interest is C. You take, give or take about, a week to finish up this entire chart. And then the next chart comes up. So once you start doing this for 15 times, 50 times, 100 times, the man said, this is not really efficient. Can I automate the process? That's how I kind of getting into space of using programming languages. And those days it was more about Fortran, assembly language. I don't know if a lot of people are that old to understand quite, older versions of program. But those are the languages that we actually started to use to automate things. And that was my first entry into vision pattern recognition with software. Right, that's how it kind of started up and started playing with a lot of data. Now, with time, as my exposure and experience, morphed and able to enter, a lot of different consumer-based industries, start getting into more, I would say, artificial intelligence, the nomenclature that's being used today, and
Right.
start to get out from visual analytics more into textual analytics, synthetic data creation, labeling, training, inference, all the jargon that you can think of from Oxford Dictionary about AI. Everything got exposed in some shape or form. And I'm still excited because, what I learned today in the space of AI is totally irrelevant tomorrow. So you've got to be constantly, reading books, looking at what the state of the art research topics are, and it kind of get me going. And a company like Qualcomm, where we put a lot of investments in AI, and Qualcomm participates, in multiple form factors from handsets all the way to automotive. And we launch, give or take, about 200 to 300 applications every given year. You get exposed to a ton of material, right? So which means that you learn and then you constantly try to make sure you adapt to really solve those problems. So I think, long story short, that keeps me excited, and that's how I'm in the world of AI.
Well, that's an amazing journey, and I think it is true that it's great to have that experience of almost just manually
Yeah,
engaging with classification and data. In the world of cloud, we don't often everything's abstracted.
that's correct.
So in some ways, I think that's always a good base to go back to. That's an interesting part of your story. And then just sort of professionally, why product management? Why wouldn't you be? I'm just curious. Like,
Great question. I think as part of my role in Qualcomm, right, I think I should say as product managers, I have the absolute privilege to really think blue sky, and working with some fantastic research and engineering colleagues of mine, we translate that vision into reality, right? So I think as a product manager, you really have the foundation to understand what do you do outside the box? What does an experience really mean? Can I decipher that experience into what needs to happen on the hardware side, what needs to happen on the software side, combining them together? I think as a product manager, you get the entire pipe exposed. And I think that's the luxury, that's the privilege. And I really enjoy doing that portion of it. And obviously, since you participate in, let's say, multiple form factors, you do a ton of things, right? So that's how I view my job. And that's been a pleasure so far.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have a lot I want to ask you about that because but before we get there, I think it's so interesting that you have like the form factor, hardware form factor, as well as software, as well as data, because we're in
Right.
a kind of interesting space now where hardware is back in the front row
That is correct.
in a way that it hasn't been before. But before we get to that, I think, one of the things I'd love to talk to you about is really sounds silly, but the promise of generative AI. Is it as big as we think it is? I've got friends in the investment world who are like, it's bigger. I've got other friends who are like, it's going to peter out. What do you think? Is AI as bigger or not as big as the hype?
Maybe I'll start with a very personal example of mine. Right, give or take about 4 months ago, right, I get a call from my 70-year-old mother at 5 a.m. in the morning. And whenever you get a call, you always think, man, it's for the worst. She calls up and, after a 5-second silence, she says, are you working on AI? So I told, man, it took me 25 years, to
Finally, I'm in.
that that I'm working on AI space. I said, okay, maybe there's not the time to ask these kind of career questions. Is everything okay? Then she said, no, I have a unique problem. Can you help me out? So I'm trying to understand what exactly is your problem. She says, apparently she has taken a lot of pictures, and then she has a ton of social media friends. And she downloaded an app that removes wrinkles in her face and makes her 20 years younger. So she was quite happy. And I was happy that she's happy. And the reason I try to bring up this example is for two reasons. One is generative AI has actually made AI relevant. It really connects up people of all age groups, right? You're able to get use cases which are meaningful to the audience. Right. So I think from that perspective, it has really made AI relevant. Maybe, to emphasize that. And the second reason is, she called me up is because her free quota of 25 photos is done and she has to pay for it, which means that she was using the cloud resources to really get this stuff done. and she wants more, and she cannot do it because scalability comes with cost. And this is where edge AI becomes much more important, is because you really do not have to get into this model of pay for eternity to really scale to a different model of enablement. So I think from that perspective, I think it's important why AI is reaching a common man, and what are some of the challenges if you really want to scale to really do a ton of use cases. So from that perspective, I think a ton of things to do. So Gen AI, is going to move.
Interesting. I kind of cringe now. I think, should I say Gen AI? Because I think you're right. There's kind of a group of, there's Gen AI, which people think of LLMs. That's where we're
Yes,
all having fun. ChatGPT is my new best friend and research analyst, right? But there's something more. You mentioned AGI. Help us
correct.
as listeners kind of think about, like, what are the buckets of AI that we should be thinking about now as we think about, like, now through the next 5-7 years?
So I think when you look at AI from my perspective, right, you have this traditional ML, which is more about classification, detection, segmentation, beautification, all kind of things, right, which is very vision oriented. You can also expand that to recommendation engines or speech kind of stuff, right? Which a lot of people have been doing for quite some time, either using computer vision algorithms and or have morphed into be very deep learning based architectures to kind of improve on the accuracy, right? So that's one portion of it. The second portion of it is obviously if you move a little bit further, you get into more generative AI concepts. It's where it's all about creating synthetic content, or kind of creating an intelligent personal assistant, right? Wherein you have the LLMs or LVMs or multimodality autoregressive models kind of behavioral patterns. I would say probably it's the second bucket, which is getting a lot of hype these days. And the next evolution, in my view, is more the artificial general intelligence, wherein, from my perspective, I think it's more about putting common sense into AI, right? So that it can understand the contextual information, it can understand the history behind a certain ask, and then be much more personalized to be able to be connect to it. I'm not suggesting you create a Terminator kind of environment. That's the most extreme version of it, but it's more, making it much more useful. Now, getting to a phase of AGI takes time, but I think a lot of investments these days are kind of marching towards that front.
That's interesting. So I've heard a lot about, like, agents lately too in AI. So would that, let me check my thinking here. So it's sort of like ML. We're working with the data we've got. We're strong arming this thing through generative AI. It's creating new content.
Yeah,
And then over here we have AGI, where it's planning. It's able to kind of understand if it's right or wrong and correct itself. In the middle, between that kind of future point, is this agent business, right? That's
right,
kind of taken hold recently.
correct.
Help me understand what that is.
Great question. And now, when you look at even LLMs today, right, to a large extent, it's very dumb in nature. It actually acts like a natural language understanding kind of concepts, wherein you ask certain things that provides you a certain response. But if you want to get to a phase wherein you want to be much more specific, the question really becomes as, can I have contextual information as part of the prompt? So that's one piece of it, right? Now, if I happen to have information that is already stored in databases, so that I can actually go retrieve the most appropriate information that
Mm-hmm.
is meaningful from a context standpoint. So you have elements around, vector databases integrating on a platform, and some of the embedding models to really extract information that can be stored as part of the vector database.
Mm-hmm.
Then the question kind of comes up, okay, you have all this contextual information, you know exactly what you want to retrieve. What do I do with that information? Right? So that you happen to have an intelligent agent that makes a decision, or in this case, an orchestration that says, with the enough information that you have, can I give you the response? If not, should I be having some kind of an interface with the cloud through a plugin? And that gets you to the next stage. Now, those plugins could be a navigation plugin, could be an enterprise plugin, could be even booking your travels, as an example, based on the information you provided. So I think making that transition from the edge to the cloud and making it as smooth as possible with that contextual information kind of I think completes the definition of agent both in and out as well.
Oh, that's really helpful, because I think a lot of times we think of agents as doing a job. They just have a job
Correct.
to do, which is true. Is a kind of job, like just run a job. But specific to this, the part of the job is this an appropriate answer? Is this the
Correct.
correct data? Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Because I think just kind of, I mean, when you think about where you're working, you have so much very specific data
Correct.
that nobody else has. has that kind of, I guess what I'd like to transition to is how are you thinking about, you know, keeping the giant business of Qualcomm running across these many different domains while still threading innovation into your overall roadmap?
I think end of the day, when you look at it, right, it really looks at what segments and what problem statement you're really trying to solve, right? So, for example, you could look at automotive environment, which is seeing a lot of innovation using AI. Infotainment is one area, and ADAS, which is very external oriented, is a different area.
What is
So, when
that
you,
again?
the infotainment, which
Yeah.
is in cabin, is one portion, right? And then you have ADAS, which is automated driving, the L1, L2, L3, L4 kind of stuff. Now, I have an old car, like I have a 20-year-old car. And
Nice.
every time, there's a blinker light that comes up, I have no idea what it's supposed to do. So I have to open up my 300-page manual. I have to look at the color of the light, the shape of the light, the frequency of blinking, and then I have to make a mental math and say, this is what it means, open up my book, and then, say, okay, this is what it is. Now you happen to have an intelligent agent. Now, the intelligent agent, if it is trained appropriately, you happen to have a lot of manuals about the car. So, which means your personal assistant or your LLM, which is inbound within the car environment, is trained to specific data. In this case, the data is the car manual, so that it knows exactly all the information. So, you ask information, hey, my car has stopped working. What do you think it is? It has the contextual background. It has specific structural information about the car itself, and it's giving you a prediction saying that it could be reasons A, B, and C. I think you have to take your car for service. Do you want me to make an appointment? And it does it for you. That's what is the next stage of evolution. And you're able to do it because you have access to the manuals of the car itself, which is very specific, and you get it done, right? That's how you go from, I would say, a foundational element to a domain element to a task specific function, right? That's how you kind of support it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in this case, it's very structured, right? You know exactly what needs to happen. Now, you have the other extreme, which is more a productivity use case. And, people are very familiar with Chat GPT and the wonders that it can do, which is awesome because I think it kind of gave users a lot of experience on what an intelligent productivity assistant is. But the biggest challenge has been is here, when I specifically ask a question, it obviously gives a response, but it does not understand the personal attributes of the user. Is the person asking the question or a 5-year-old, a 40-year-old, or a 70-year-old? How can I make sure the responses match the emotional intelligence of the user? Right. So in this case, you want that LLM to be specifically trained with user specific information so that the output predictions or the output recommendations that provide matches the user preferences. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which means you need to collect a lot of, structured data about the user, either in a supervised or a semi-supervised manner, locally train that model to give you that information that can be presented as a foundation to a chat GPT as an example to make that prediction even more cleaner. So again, it's a different kind of a problem statement. And this is more, I would say, productivity oriented. The one which I mentioned is more automotive environment oriented. And you have many of the same problem statements that you look at stuff. So I think end of the day is, if you have access to structured or non-structured data, depending upon the problem statement, you utilize it and get it done. Now, when the data, if it is user specific, you want to make sure is you don't share that with anybody else, right? It wants to be private enough, it's secure enough, and you get things done. So I think there's different ways to look at it, but I think these are some of the fundamentals that we kind of focus on.
Interesting. So in the automotive example, I really like that. Let me say it back to you to see if I get it right. Because what you're saying is the sort of baseline is it's structured and known, educating
Yes,
structured and known, right? Because we
right,
know we have all these manuals, we have a lot we know about how cars work.
correct,
Your specific car may be behaving within a range of certain, errors or performance, right? And so we can kind
correct,
of connect those intelligently. And then
correct.
the next level you're saying of abstraction, or the next level of like intention that we might want to bring to the game is, okay, who is that car owner?
That
Where,
is correct.
and that's information that's structured in some ways because we can just gather it, like who bought that car and what my gas station is. But you're saying
Exactly.
some of it is unstructured and sort of observed. Perhaps you can
Exactly.
connect that. Okay,
Exactly.
so
It learns with time. It knows exactly what your behavioral pattern is. You don't want to make a call which is 20 miles away and then book, your appointment with the car dealer. You know that your GPS location is here. You usually, go towards making a car appointment which is 5 miles away from your residence, and that will
mhm.
make it much more easier. But again, it's kind of learning itself. That's the intention is, can I take unstructured data and make it much more structured that is connecting to the user?
Yeah, I think everyone's really interested in understanding. This is a good example. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about it. Everybody really wants to know more about how this is going to play out in real world scenarios, like sort of over the next, like today, tomorrow. One of my favorite Bill Gates quotes is, "It's like very easy to predict what's going to happen in 2 years or 20 years. It's the 5 to 10 year range that's
Yep.
so hard to understand." And I'm particularly interested because I don't really know enough about mobile or automotive. Can you kind of give me like a snapshot? What's going on in the automotive world right now for data and AI? How are people thinking about the opportunities and the concerns?
I think in an automotive environment, there's been a big revolution on how to actually bring in a lot of unique experiences. The experiences, when you look at from an auto perspective, are going to be either assistance to a large extent or decision making based on visual data. So, what I mean by saying that is when you are inside a car, you want to be monitoring the driver. So, in this case, what we call as a driver monitoring system. So you want to make sure that the driver is in a proper state so that certain actions or predictions can be done. So in this case, you want to really make sure is he sleepy, is he angry, is he dozing off, kind of things. But understanding the emotional state of the user is very difficult, right?
I'm very interested in this because I'm teaching my kids to drive right now. So I want to know all about this.
Right. So one of the biggest challenges is how do you collect data, and then how do you classify the data based on emotions? And one of the biggest challenges when you look at automotive domain is you really don't have access to a ton of data. So you put a lot more focus on synthetic data and say, this is a 60-year-old male with glasses in a dark background, or a 60-year-old female wearing a mask and then wearing a cap. So when you happen to have a lot of these attributes on a face, by definition understanding emotion becomes tough. So then you have to make a prediction, right? Is my prediction going to be right or prediction going to be wrong? Now, to a large extent, when you have the synthetic data, you create a model, obviously, and then you look at your emotional, state of the user, and then to a large extent, that emotional state is very generic information. It's like, guys, for a million data points, this is what I've created. But the most important thing is how can I continuously dynamically update that information so that it's kind of fine tuned to the user. So, which means the physical camera that's present, you want to be capturing faces about the user whenever there's no mask kind of stuff. You look at maybe certain tricks on your skin. Hey, when you smile, this is what happens. You look at the templates, you match the templates, and it kind of adapts to itself, right? And that's a challenging problem because you want the error rate to be as small as possible. It can never be perfect, but you have to be in a position to self-learn. So that is a kind of one is actually developing a model, and it cannot be static. The second thing is extracting more information about the user once it's deployed, and then constantly changing the bias functions to make it much more, I would say, predictable to reduce the false rates, for lack of a better word. So that is one thing, right? And the second element we talked about is the personal assistant, wherein you have all those dashboards. You want to be talking to your dashboard and making a lot of predictions, right? So that's what I think most of the industry is focused on. Now, there are going to be certain instances wherein people are talking about, can I use text to image kind of creation or a text to video kind of creation for entertainment purposes, maybe for kids in the backseat. It's a possibility, but that's more a niche use case, right? The most common use cases has been driver state, occupancy monitoring.
So the first thing people are concerned with is driver state and monitoring kind of all this observed
That
data.
is correct.
And then
Correct.
the second one is more around,
Oh,
assistance agents that
exactly.
you think of more.
Personal assistant using voice commands and making a prediction, right? So that's what is most of the emphasis is.
Hmm.
And the biggest challenge, as I mentioned, is lack of data. And once you happen to have data, how can you continue to improve the prediction? And last but not the least is you need to have connectivity to the cloud as well, right? In some shape or form. How do you do it? Those kind of things, right?
I
So
have a
it's an
million
interesting
questions.
domain.
A million questions because there's like getting the data right. You really have to have people agree to participate in this
That's correct.
and understand what they're agreeing to in a domain that's
Yeah,
like none of us really understand where this thing. You know what I mean? Where the edges of this thing are going.
that is correct.
So tell me a little bit about. I guess let me back up and say, as a product manager, how are you understanding what you want to do when the people you're giving this product to may not even know how to consume it, how to engage with you, to give you their data? How are you picking your priorities here?
Yeah, that's the one of the most interesting challenges is how do you really go solve a system problem? And when you happen to have a ton of these problems, right? And that's the reason, when you don't have access to a lot of user emotional state to
Yeah.
really begin with, you have to rely on synthetic data to really create that scenario. And once you've
Synthetic.
created the scenario,
Did I hear you correctly? Synthetic.
synthetic data, right? So once you've created that synthetic data to create a model, then the question becomes is when you deploy it, how can you change it and morph to the user? Now, you absolutely bring up a fair point as the user may or may not consent, right? So you'll have to kind of work through that scenario.
Hmm.
Now, at times, this is where I think what we call as a shadow mode is for example, you're in a happy state of mind, and the driver monitoring system believes that you are drowsy and then takes an action and then parks the car into the lane. You
Hmm.
override the decision and say this is wrong. So at that point of time, that information is stored back to the cloud, suggesting that the wrong, a decision was made, and then behind the scenes it computes why a certain wrong decision was made and look at opportunities to correct it. So which means that it kind of always mimics what the user's intent to do and what should have happened in the right place, and then make corrections. Now, what is the accuracy? Does it change with time? Not quite sure, but these are some of the challenges that the auto industry is actually looking at to make predictions much more better moving forward.
How do you avoid hallucination in that scenario where the machine might be saying like, "Well, this is what we think you should be doing because it's sort of the most optimized path."
Yeah, that's
Is that something you worry about here, or is that not relevant because
Oh,
you're
absolutely. I mean, when you look at automated driving, all the ADAS scenarios, L3, L4, wherein there's absolutely no driver, it looks at certain situations and makes decisions on its own. And always they don't turn out to be correct. And this is one of the fundamental challenges is how can you be more predictable? How can you really remove the false rejects? And that's not really fully understood yet because it's, again, lack of data. And how do you really do much more with less data is what the emphasis points is from an auto industry standpoint.
Hmm.
With time it's going to change possibly, but these are some of the biggest hurdles being looked at, right? So
No.
right, so
Interesting. So,
yeah.
same question around the mobile phone side of the world. Help me understand. What are the key existential questions in the mobile phone side of your business when you think
Yeah, I
about
think on the handset side, it has not become extremely
handset?
consumer.
Right.
Yeah, on the handset side, it's become very consumer oriented. So, which means people use your handsets or cell phones for, let's say, photographs or taking videos. The question becomes is how can I artificially make the videos or images better? So which means, for good or bad reason, you take a picture in the night, it realizes that the background is extremely dark, and then using AI makes adjustments to make you look nice, look younger, you're perfect, like a model, right? Which is kind of self-enabled. And there are going to be other instances wherein you want your handset to be a much more useful personal assistant. In other words, if you happen to have 20 to 30 notifications that are kind of coming up, right? You just do not have the bandwidth to look at every notification. So you want to have your, a quick summary of the notifications that your mobile phone can tell, hey, this is what it is. This is the most important one. Please pay relevance to it. So which means it kind of deciphers and takes certain decisions and gives you a quick summary as a function of it. So you want to use it as a productivity assistant. You also want to be helping, improve on image quality, improve on video quality, those kind of stuff. So I think, it's very consumer oriented on their handset side.
Interesting. Well, now I love. No one likes to talk about software more than me, and product management more than me. But I'm also kind of interested. I'm just picturing you going into your meeting room where you've got the people who are worried about bandwidth and scale, and you've got the people who are worried about ethics, and and all the kind of ancillary questions. I thought maybe we could just talk about that a little bit. So just from a like scaling and supporting, like how do you support this type of thing in real time over a handset or in an automotive setting? Are there special engineering requirements?
Oh, absolutely. So, end of the day, as I was trying to say before, is you look at what is your key performance indicator. What is the problem statement you're really trying to solve? And once you try to decipher it, either it's quality of service, either it's concurrency, or it's accuracy, have the bounding boxes defined. Once the bounding boxes are defined, you know exactly what needs to happen, which
Mm-hmm.
means that you have the necessary investment on the hardware side, either from a compute, from a bandwidth, from a memory standpoint, to really host the model to get things done. And from a software standpoint, do you have enough information which is extracted real time to make that decision based off a predefined algorithm that's already there, right? And then
Yeah.
go for it. So it's a kind of a combination of few things, I would say. But the most important element usually kind of comes down to is when you deploy it real time. Again, as I mentioned, is there are always mistakes made. Can I learn from those mistakes and dynamically change? And that's the difficult part from a software standpoint, is because most of the data that you collect needs to be supervised or semi-supervised, which means you need to have human in the loop to make an improvement in that. You want to get to a state where it is completely unsupervised, and that's difficult because the machine has to make that prediction, and sometimes it's not
We're not
always
quite
the
there
right
yet.
one.
Yeah, we're
Exactly.
not quite there yet. I think would you say that maybe we're deferring some of the like cost to benefit analysis
Yes.
while we're all sort of deferring that, I think, while we're figuring out what we can do with AI.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Right. There's always going to be different price points, consumer goods. You can't put a ton of resources there. Then you have to intelligently make certain choices and then go from there. Yeah.
I often hear like people are using this for call center. They take their, their handbook of all their manuals and everything they do at the call center and like
Correct.
using it. And I think when you look at the processing costs, it's
Yes.
not clear that that's a huge advantage for every business. But I think that people are experimenting in that space because it's very straightforward.
It's interesting you bring up because one of the partners we were trying to bring up in Asia, and one of those actually suggesting is when they do a language translation for movies, right, and they try to watch on their phone, it costs them give or take between 50 cents to $1 to run it on the cloud for every 1 hour. For every user, right? That's the infrastructure cost just to get language translation set up. Now, just imagine you want to offer this free and there's millions of subscribers. You just can't scale. That's the problem, right? So, end of the day, they really want to have share of wallet. They want to push the language translation on the edge-based device. Either could be your laptop or could be your tablet or your mobile phone. But the most important thing is, do you happen to have the algorithm and do you have enough compute resources to really provide that real time experience, right? You cannot really be lagging behind with the video frame, right? So these are some of the stuff that you kind of look at.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, it's clear in this conversation that Qualcomm is incredibly dedicated to AI innovation as part of its overall product strategy. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about so that's like check. We know that's happening. The flip side of that is helping your customers get through their concerns so they can adopt the offering, right? And some of those concerns are around ethics, but containing bias, keeping data private. Maybe just share with me what your thoughts and maybe the Qualcomm point of view is on how that's really going to work in a very large federated environment like yours.
I think it's a great question. I think from a Qualcomm perspective, we put a lot of emphasis, let's say, on bias elimination. And this really starts off with how we look at training data. How is the data being collected? Is it being labeled properly? Is it annotated properly? Is it filtered properly? And then once you've created the model, when you look at predictions, is the predictions based on the data set accurate enough? Is it repeatable enough? You have to go through a lot of system tests to make sure that it is good before you go to a B2B or a B2C kind of engagement.
Mm.
And or if you've seen a lot of commercial related challenges, how soon can you update it? How soon can you fix it? These are some of the stuff from an infra standpoint becomes much more meaningful. Then the other portion is, apart from bias, is regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance is becoming extremely important, especially in the world of generative AI, when you're starting looking at personal AI assistant. And today's complex world, whenever you deploy these large models, you want to make sure the political views are respected, or certain nationalistic views are respected. Or if you don't want to provide an inappropriate answer, you make sure that you get a certain canned response for a certain question. How can you make the responses less harmful, to the user? And or if you're trying to create synthetic content, from a text to image or a text to video standpoint, you don't create any vulgar or gang signs for kids. They need to be appropriate enough, right? So these are big initiatives, and we put a lot of emphasis on really focusing on the specifications by working with a lot of regulatory bodies, and at the same time is how do you ingest that regulatory compliance in terms of commercial deployment. Now, there's not obviously a perfect solution, but this is something that we continuously learn before we put them into a lot of devices.
Yeah, it's particularly hard, I think, for Qualcomm, right? Because such a huge company. They're
Right.
international. They're competing international regulations, federal, state.
Exactly.
So many layers to not just to get right in one context, but sort of
That is correct.
cross context. So I think that's something that we hear a lot of companies are really struggling with is not just how to do it the first time, but also how to prove you did it and be auditable. It's
Exactly, right? Exactly.
part of it.
Absolutely correct. No, no, absolutely correct, right? So these are tough challenges, and we have plenty of research and engineering teams focused on that, while at the same time trying to participate in government bodies to understand what it means, right? Because, when you read the specs, how do you transform that specs into a compliance? When you deploy it is very different, right? So that's what I think, having teams work on it quite effectively is very important, and we put a lot of emphasis on that.
My 2 cents on it is I think commercial leaders like you are going to be the ones who help regulators understand what is happening
Yes,
enough that they can regulate it. I think that's a really important role right now because I think regulators, we always, I've worked with regulators throughout my whole career, and sometimes they get a bad rap. They don't have all the information either.
I know.
And so that makes sense to me. I was curious in the bias area and in terms of like leaning into AGI. You have an academic background. How are you going to work? Is there going to be more synergy between the academic world and the business world? Well, in the short term, do you think?
I think absolutely. So we really have a strong participation with a lot of research institutes
Okay.
across the globe, in fact. And then we participate in some of their research projects. We invest in some of the research proposals that they have. We try to invite students. We try to get their feedback on what they have learned, because some of the investments from these research schools are amazing, right? So we believe in strong collaboration because they kind of provide a different perspective from a commercial deployment standpoint that we leverage, and then try to see how best we can kind of translate that investment into commercial deployment as well.
That's interesting, especially when you talk about bias. I think it's just
That
been
is
such
correct.
an intractable problem.
Exactly. Right. And bias thesis is very critical, right? And it's quite subjective as well. And you want to make sure that you put the right emphasis on expanding the definition of bias.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, yeah, I have a million. We should do a separate show on bias. I think it's such an interesting, so many smart people working on it, and like we really haven't covered enough ground.
Yes.
One,
Absolutely.
and then two, I just think the infrastructure support of constantly monitoring bias and adjusting
Yes.
appropriately over the long haul with unstructured data and multiple data streams. That seems like an interesting hard problem all by itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As we kind of come to the end of our discussion here and reflecting on how fast this, well, it's interesting because from your perspective, it's not an overnight thing. It's been a long history. It's like the overnight success of 20 years.
Yeah. My mentors used to say is, if you win an Olympic medal, people always count your world record, or it's not the 9 seconds that counts. It's the 20 years of investment to get towards that 9 seconds.
Yeah, I think that's in a moment we're experiencing right now. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. Absolutely. So as you're thinking about this, for us, who are not experts, what are you looking as you look forward? What are some things you're looking for as like the green flags, some like super positive achievements in the AI world that you're going to say, oh yeah, now we're making this happen.
Yeah, I think starting with not personal example, right? Making AI relevant to all age groups. So I think that's super important. We're able to connect to them, make their life much more easier. It is something translating from research into a consumer space and then commoditizing it, right? So that's quite critical. If you're able to do that, that's awesome. A
Yeah.
second portion of it, I would think, is translating from a general inference to a personalized inference. And getting towards a personalized inference is very difficult, right? You really want your machines to be much more predictable, much more accurate, and be reflective of your character. It's easier said than done, right? So if you're able to get to that state, that's awesome. And
Mhm.
last but not the least is, as I mentioned always, is infusing common sense. You want to understand the context before a prediction is presented, before a conclusion is present, and getting to a world of AGI, right? And that's where I think you've truly mimicked to a large extent a human brain. And if you're able to get to that phase, which I guess is your big blue sky at some point of time, then you've taken giant steps towards that fact. So I think if these fundamental blocks are kind of resolved, that's awesome. Now, obviously, ton of things needs to happen. You need to have access to data. You can make sure it's all clean data, it's structured, all of that stuff. But when I look at what is the goalposts, right? That's how I kind of look at things.
So interesting. I think one of the main things I'm taking away from talking with you, and I'm so happy you're talking about it, is the nuanced complexity of personalization. We've been talking about personalization for such a long time, but it's been pretty ham-handed,
Correct. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think I've just reflexively accepted that kind of baseline personalization. But what you're talking about is something much more nuanced and interesting. So I'm going to think more about that. Personalization might need a makeover
Oh, absolutely.
in the tech world, might need a makeover. Just a couple more quick questions for you, which is as from a product perspective, do you think product management is going to change as a discipline or is changing as a discipline with the in the age of generative AI?
I believe so. I think it's end of the day, it's really the mentality that really matters. From my perspective, I usually try to have a certain amount of dynamic tension with my engineering and research buddies. That's because I usually challenge them to get the best of me, and I expect the same of them to get the best of them. So when you try to be in this environment wherein you really want to think as a product, you define as a product, and you want to get the best out of the product, I think the right place to be in is as product manager. But to be successful there, you got to have the right mindset, obviously a strong technical acumen, a strong cross-functional leader, be respectful, be a good listener, and always be a student at heart, right? If you even have a 15-year-old college grad comes and educates you, you better listen because it's not that you shut it down. I think from that perspective, I think as a product guy makes a ton of sense.
I like that. That'll kind of segue to my last question. I always like to ask our especially in something like this. So many of us in the tech world, every day I wake up and I feel like I'm behind. There's so much I haven't read. Even the biggest experts in AI that I've had a chance to interview, they have told me they're like, yeah, I'm also behind. Right. So are there any like special articles, Substacks, podcasts that you think, your, other product managers like you should be taking a look at?
A great question. Personally, I view it as it's like Swiss cheese, with a lot of holes. You got to pick your holes you want to fill first, right? So you got to say, if those holes are mostly around technical aspects of it, then I jump onto. There's a lot of good talks coming out from Stanford, coming out from MIT that talk about data science. They talk about implementation of AI and use cases, right? So I kind of look at that and then try to motivate myself. Okay, maybe we should be looking at things from a technical aspect of stuff, right? The other aspect of it is being in product manager, at least from a Qualcomm perspective, you always come up with a different set of problems every single day. And the most important thing is not to give up, right? Is to maintain your perseverance and then try to make sure you can solve this problem. And this way, you've got to have a source of motivation. And I try to get my motivation from watching sports. And one of my greatest coach has been Coach Saban from Alabama, right from Crimson Tide, and the mentorship he has provided and or some of the speeches he provides kind of gives confidence in how you can actually take a sports scenario and then put it into your personal life, right? And if you're able to do it, then you have a technical acumen. You got do not die kind of attitude. You push it together, pump it up together, and then go forward. And
I like that.
obviously, you have some thick skin.
Well, that's required in this business, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you and get a chance to talk to you about this. It sounds like Qualcomm has some amazing innovation that it's working through and offering now and in the future. And I look forward to maybe having you come back to our podcast. We can talk a little bit more about bias and where you've moved on to in the next couple of years. It would be great to reconnect. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on your show, Jocelyn.